What I'm going to talk today is about trends looking forward, things that merge. I'm not going to go province through every province and the three territories and give blow-by-blow description of what initiatives have happened this year and what's coming up on the horizon. That would take all day and be very, very boring. I do have a reference for you at the end where you can go and find that kind of information. But what I've tried to do is lift up the general trends from Canada with a few references to what's happening internationally that might be relevant. There is nothing in that I'm going to say that is going to present the model for Newfoundland and Labrador. That would not be possible for me to do. That's what you have to do. And the other reality is that every jurisdiction, every province and territory in Canada has a different starting point based on what's already there. And we have to work with what we already have in place to think about how we might go forward. So for instance, in Ontario, junior kindergarten is for 4-year-olds has been universally available for a long time, and the take-up rate is about 90%. Before 90% of 4-year-olds take part in a junior kindergarten program. Over the last, it was introduced in the late 60s and grew to be widespread province-wide through the 90s, and it's been highly taken up. You could not design the next steps without taking that into account and the professionals who were working in it. So it was a reality for that province that is not a reality for other provinces. So Ontario does not provide the perfect model for you. When BC looks at what it's got its Strong Start programs, which are family resource centers operated directly by the school board, the school boards in 50% of their schools, staffed by early childhood educators. It's well entrenched. Those educators are part of local labor groups, et cetera, et cetera. You couldn't go forward in BC without taking that particular component in hand. So, and everybody has different demographic and geographical realities, and Kathy mentioned that here. So what I'm going to talk about are some trends that are happening and some commonalities that are cutting across jurisdictions, but there's nothing here that's the model for Newfoundland. Okay, so first of all, I want to give a definition of early childhood education, and I do understand that there's different language, and those of you who may not be immersed in the sector may find this, sometimes talk about early learning and childcare, and early childhood education, and to some extent they can be interchangeable terms, and other times they have specific meanings. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, I think there are some differences, and they're laid out in the discussion paper. Okay, about what the early learning is here, and across here the childcare, early childhood education is here. I'm talking about early childhood education. That was the common umbrella term we used for early years study, and we defined it as any time children are together where there's an intentional pedagogy and qualified educators. So it's not just licensed childcare, early learning and childcare that's licensed. It included everything where children might be coming together, where there was some intentionality, purposeful play, and there were qualified educators in early childhood education. So that includes many of the parenting family literacy programs, the Strong Start in BC, because they have an intentional early learning framework curriculum that they use, and they have ECEs. It includes includes pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and those sorts of programs are directly operated by the school. So it was for the purposes of the early years study, it was a broad definition that was defined that way. Early childhood education is a powerful engine of opportunity and addresses equity issues. In fact, the OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, which did Strong Start 1, Strong Start 2, and Strong Start 3 that many of you are familiar with, they did a survey for Strong Start 3, which is a toolbox, and I'll come back to that later. And they found that among the member countries, and we are a member country, that equity was the #1 goal for early childhood education. People, the government officials and others in the sector who responded to the survey identified equity as the #1 goal, equity amongst children. They did not define labor force participation for parents as the #1 goal. They did not define readiness for school as the #1 goal, but this notion of equality of opportunity, some equity amongst all families and children, which is kind of interesting. Early childhood education can be an essential anchor to pull together that whole panoply we have of programs and services, including family supports, family resource, child care, early intervention, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, prenatal, postnatal, etc. Integration has to happen at multiple levels, and definitely that was a trend and trend that is popping up across our countries and internationally, of trying to build a more integrated platform so that families have something that they can find and understand in their communities, and that is actually a smarter way to spend money. That is an overriding theme we're seeing across this country, and we're certainly seeing it in other jurisdictions. Not that it's an easy one. So many of you have seen this before, and those of you who were there last night saw a version of it, but we'll see it again. This is what exists now pretty much everywhere. Even where there's been some efforts to pull things together, we still have something that looks like this. We have a state or provincial, territorial level of government with multiple departments or ministries who are involved, who then we have local or regional authorities that are closer to the ground, and then in the community we have something that looks like this. And this works amazing number of countries. Go, oh yes, that's us. Australia, that's us. England, that's us. States, absolutely. And what we have then, this is a family who has a child, a young child, that's what's out in their community. A mass of different things are happening, okay? And if you need this, if you need speech and language, or you want some support on breastfeeding, you go here. If you want childcare, you go there. If you want play group, you go there. And often in some of our most disadvantaged communities, we have a lot of services and programs and a lot of investment, but it's not being terribly effective. It's not, people can't find it. Those who need it the most don't always get there. Those in the know how to access it and use the resources. We're not really, this is not a smart way to spend money, okay? This is not an efficient, this is not meeting the needs of many families, and what one of the goals of what we're talking about, we talk about in earlier study 3, and many communities and places around the world are talking about, is how do we make something that's more of an integrated platform that's still very responsive to children and families in a local region. Nobody is calling for, I don't think, something that's a cookie cutter and it always is done this way, and so forth and so on. But how can we have something with some design around it, that design programs that make some sense out of that? No, I've moved on to the next one, I see. Make some sense out of that for families, and it can be done in a financially possible way that's sustainable. And this is kind of a design of what many people are calling for, and it doesn't all show up real well with the lights, but the idea is having early childhood, an integrated delivery platform that can provide a range of things. Doesn't mean everything would happen to have to happen in the same location, but co-location may be part of it. But there's one place, when you know what you get at a school, you know what you get at a health center, what do you get at an early childhood center? Or how could you come in one door and find what you need without having to re-register at another door? And that's really the goal. And that will require some integration at the neighborhood and school level, integration around local decision making, and then public policy and infrastructure. For those of you who were there last night, there was a question towards the end of, to Margaret about, this is all fine and good, but do you have any idea how complicated it is? You've got different cultures, different policies, different regulations. Social services is very different than education, than health. Absolutely true. It's not an easy thing to do, and all of those, you have to deal with it at each level, and that's what a number of jurisdictions are finding. You can't just plunk early childhood services into education as a unit and walk away. Saskatchewan's done that, and now they're trying hard to integrate across and not just have taking of a unit and moving here, and it operates in exactly the same way. You've got to think about how you mesh all of those policies and regulations. We have and taking into account different starting points. Where are the easy wins? And then how can you build from that? What resources already there? What we do know from international research is that's a whole lot more efficient. We can take the same money and do better with it. That is not to say you don't need more money to serve all of the people all of the time. Absolutely not. But it does mean we could get a platform in place that could make better use of existing and new money, rather than continuing to fund things independently and regulate things independently and have different infrastructure set up. And I am going to get to the role that schools may have to play in this and talk a little bit more about that. So I'm going to talk about specifically about trends around governance, funding, access, learning environment, and accountability, particularly in Canada, but again with some references elsewhere. And then I'm going to take you to the ECE report that was done in 2011, which is really a measure of how system development is going towards the vision that was back here, okay, towards that in each of the provinces. And many of you have seen that before, but just to anchor it back there. So first of all, governance. What we have now is the oversight for all of those services and programs and for early childhood education, either in split or single departments and ministries, okay? In BC, we have, for example, there are 3 ministries, and they're called 3 ministries involved. There's the Child and Family Services that is responsible for funding and so on for childcare. Licensing is done through health for regulated childcare, and early learning is the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education is responsible for those Strong Start programs that are, 300 out of 600 schools have those programs. So it's a fairly significant program there. They have a well-developed, beautiful early learning framework that was done by the Ministry of Education, and it's used by the Strong Start centers. Childcare, though, childcare and preschool, of which there is a lot, does not use, for the most part, that early learning framework because it's over in the Ministry of Education. It's a 0 to 6 framework, but it's in the Ministry of Education, and it doesn't apply to childcare and preschool. Now, some people are taking it up and some colleges are using it, but you see what happens when things are split. The province doesn't provide, they provide training and support and some really neat kinds of tools for the Strong Start centers, but they're not offered to the childcare and preschool. Okay? Split jurisdiction, so just as an example of where they're at. Other, and I mentioned already Saskatchewan, which took childcare and plunked it into the education department. And in that department, they operate as a separate unit. They're starting to figure out how to mesh with the rest of the education department and not be so separate and isolated, because essentially nothing has changed on the ground. And their extensive pre-kindergarten program for 3- and 4-year-olds offered by the school has had a separate curriculum, separate staffing, and even though dealing with the same ages of kids, there hasn't been much collaboration, sharing of resources, training, and so forth and so on. So this, whereas in New Brunswick has made some massive changes and addressed some of the issues that were talked about yesterday. At the forum about the question of how do you deal with the existing structures. They have actually moved to create a very integrated infrastructure to support early childhood services and early intervention, 0 to 8, overlap with the school system. They're actually tackling that question about children with special needs who are in one age group and then they hit the school system and they have to go and be reassessed, and then before they pick up on their speech and language and that sort of thing. They're actually bridging and bringing the early intervention into the school and having it work with the school special ed department. So actually kids it's seamless for the kids. Okay, and they're setting up an infrastructure to support this happening, to bridge the worlds of community-based program delivery, that's the childcare sector, with the publicly delivered school. And they're putting people in place who are senior management levels who work with the school, work with the community, and work with the provincial department. And it's very comprehensive. It includes speech and language, family resource programs, etc. It's not just childcare and leave everything else behind, and so forth. And there's other examples. I'm not going to go through every jurisdiction, but you see very different ways about going about things. When there is a single department ministry, it becomes really possible to have a policy framework that focuses on child well-being, development, and learning versus child care being driven by labor force participation goals, and the early learning in the school that's reaching down from the school system being driven by other goals. That doesn't mean you don't design things so that it accommodates labor force participation, but you can start with the child and think about the child goals first, particularly when it comes together. And yes, you have to mesh program standards and regulations. In Ontario, when they moved into full-day kindergarten and trying to do an extended day for 4- and 5-year-olds that was seamless and school boards could directly operate the whole day, they had to amend the Education Act. They had to amend the Education Act to accommodate staff who are early childhood educators. They have to revise the Day Nurseries Act, and it has to talk to the Education Act. And they have people out in the field who are responsible for kindergarten and childcare. Okay, they're consultants. Now it's not. It's very, very messy, but it's a start at setting that infrastructure in place to move towards a more single jurisdiction, and taking into account that within department organization, and then looking at the local. It's no point of having everything integrated out here if you still have silos down to municipalities, school boards, public health units, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to figure that piece out too. So it's multi-leveled, and it's going to take a long time, no doubt about it. However, we do know from international research there is no jurisdiction that exists in the world that has been able to provide early childhood education to the vast majority of its preschool children who hasn't figured out some way of integrating their governance. Now, some of them have done it 0 to 3 and then 3 to 6, and usually they have a fairly universal 3 to 6, and 0 to 3 remains a bit patchy. But if you really want to accommodate and reach the majority of kids, it hasn't been done anywhere without coming together into a single ministry or department or authority. Coordination of ministries who are still maintain primary responsibility for various pieces has been a well tried out strategy, and it really hasn't worked anywhere that I'm aware of or the international researchers from the OECD are aware of. It hasn't moved the markers to, it may improve things for a while, it may do this, but as long as there are separate mandates, separate funding, separate reporting up, it's very difficult to coordinate on the ground, and interministerial committees haven't been terribly successful at making major changes. They've eaten around the edges of this issue, but they haven't actually managed to find a way to build a system that's available to most of the children most of the time. Funding. One of the surprises of earlier study 3 was that every jurisdiction had increased its funding, except for BC, to some extent to early childhood education since the pullback of the federal government in 2006. You know, we were all going to get we had big plans. Every province had big plans, and we would have been really a long way with that money if that had followed through. But the federal government changed, the money was pulled back, $100 baby bonus a month was instead, and the provinces were left with plans, but no money. So when we went out to do an environmental scan to see what was happening in the provinces, my colleague Carrie McQuaig and I were doing the work. We thought we'd find flat line of spending, not much happening. Lo and behold, we found that every jurisdiction had moved forward, and many were spending a lot more money than they had been between 2005 and 2011. So Fraser Mustard was in what of course, one of the authors of the earlier study was still with us then, and he said, this isn't good enough. You have to go forward and find a way to show an index of where each jurisdiction is at. If this is really happening, show me. Show me where we're at. Find a way to monitor it. If you don't measure it, it doesn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the big surprises was the increase because provinces and territories have those plans in place. They took the steps forward they could within their fiscal constraints, and they all spent more money. What was even more surprising is in the 2013 budgets, we did not see cutbacks, and we did see some increases. Not big increases, but some modest increases, and we didn't see slowdown in the early childhood education file, broadly defined. Whereas just about everything else there's been big cuts and in the public spending, but not in this one. So that's interesting. One of the things we talk about in funding is the difference between fee subsidy funding, where things are fee-based and the family's low income, government gives them a subsidy, versus program funding. Practically the only program that's fee-based is childcare, licensed childcare. All the rest receive program funding, direct funding. May not be enough, it may not have increased, whatever, but you get a program budget for a family resource center, for a CAP-C program, et cetera, et cetera. Childcare is different. It's based on a market model, and where there's a fee, and what the market can bear is really what the fees tend to be. In some provinces are really moving away from the balance on fee subsidy for childcare and putting much more money in program funding and reducing the fees, and that tends to help with higher salaries. Certainly Quebec's done that, Prince Edward Island's done that, and Manitoba's done that. And they all have caps on what parents can pay. Now, Quebec is the low-cost one, but both PEI and Manitoba also have a cap on what families pay, and then they have direct money that goes to the programs for childcare. And they also have salary scales, so there's some equity. Whereas in the rest of the country, you can be making $11 an hour, and you can be making $18 an hour, and you're at the same level, and you have the same qualification. So that's happening. We have seen one of the trends is modest salary increases, and you bet we still care the Child Care Human Resource Sector Council, which is now folded, but their last report on this did a survey of early childhood educators across the country and saw modest salary increases continue. We are seeing, in some parts of the country more than others, but we are seeing slowly the salaries increase. They still remain very low for the value of the work that's done and for the educational requirements. The only province that spends more than 3% of its provincial budget on this file is Quebec at this time. Others are around 2%, and that includes what everybody's spending on public kindergarten. Access. Well, one of the goals for this is not just to have perfect programs for an elite few, which is what happens much of the time now, but to really make access much broader. Voluntary, yes. Not everybody wants the same thing. Not every parent is in the workforce, but they still want to access something. So wanting to think about how to increase the access to all of those components and ensure that they're all there, and that those programs that provide extra efforts to marginalized and vulnerable programs, how can we build them into the fabric of an integrated platform so it's more efficient for them to do that and they can be more effective, and that we're reaching all of the kids, okay? And doing extra efforts to reach those families who struggle most and may be marginalized and have the least very small social networks, etc. And that's part of, to increase the access, we need to monitor who's coming in the door and who's not, and then how do we reach out to bring those who are not coming in the door. And one of the things that happened in New Brunswick in the demonstration sites that have informed the policy change that's happening there is that was one of the big outcomes, is the public health early intervention program people saying they're able to reach more people with their allocated program time because they're in one place. They're not doing as much administrative stuff, organizing to get people, and so forth and so on. And we had some wonderful reports from families about how they used to have to go to 5 places, and one woman said, my caseworker was on my back to go to the early years center, and I told her I didn't want to go, but she wasn't going to get off my back, so I packed up the 3 kids and thought I'd go once. And I've been going ever since for a year, because this is the first time I felt welcome. I actually don't think I'm such a bad parent anymore as I used to think I was. And I couldn't get the kids to all those damn appointments, and now we make all of them because the services are there. The speech and language I know that speech and language is going to be there for one child, and the other 2 have other activities they can do, etc., etc. And that story was repeated over and over again. And when we talk to the professionals, they say, hey, I saw 20% more families in the same amount of time as a year ago because they were all in one place. It was a lot easier, etc., etc. Even so, that's increases access. We have spent a lot of time here and in other jurisdictions talking about universality versus targeted programs. And it's not either or. You can have universal programs and target within it. We have a public health care system like that, right? It's available to all of us, but we might not have used it for a year because we weren't sick, or we only used it for the annual checkup. But then if you get sick, you might use it a lot. That doesn't mean we should all use it a lot. So it's the same way with special ed in the education system. It's targeted to kids who need it within a universal platform. So it's not about choosing universal versus targeted. It's about how we can target within universal so that we can reach the kids who need it with what they need. Access for children with special needs. It is not good enough, in my humble opinion, to provide in early childhood, to provide opportunities for children with special services. Publicly funded programs need to be required to do that, as they are in PEI in Manitoba. It's built into the regulation. They are required to accommodate children with special needs. They're provided with resources. In Ontario, there's all kinds of resources, but it's the program's discretion whether they take the child or not. And that's not good enough for publicly funded programs. So that's part of access too. And this again, the integrated program delivery platform, I think I've explained what I mean by that and how that can improve access. And we are, as a trend, everywhere across the country seeing the education system reach down and provide, in some cases, school-based program delivery platform, and in some cases providing direct delivery of early education and parenting programs. And I've talked about BC. Alberta doesn't have a policy on education providing programs for kids, or a particularly worked out policy for providing 3-year-old and 4-year-old and 2-year-old programs. But it's happening a lot. It's happening there by stealth almost. They're finding these bits and pieces of money, able to put it together from some special ed money for younger kids, and all of a sudden they can open up a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old program for everybody in the catchment area. And in some cases, the school district. Very interesting. 300 school authorities in that province. So, and they have more autonomy to spend their money than anywhere else. So it's very interesting what's happening there. You have the education system here reaching down. Okay, the reaching down with Kid Start. Did I get that right? The Kinder Start. Kinder Start is a 6-week, I think, program that for children prior to school entry. There also the education ministry here is working on a curriculum framework. Now I understand that really is working collaboratively with child and youth services and working together on that. And I'm going to come back to that when I get into the learning environment. But we do see education reaching down and figuring out. Education has figured, as a sector, has figured out this matters. They figured out, I think, as a sector, that by thinking about early childhood and bringing families into the system one way or another earlier is only going to improve what happens in schools. I think we're on our way to that. We've had a lot of concern about schoolification, pushing down. We're actually seeing the opposite in some jurisdictions. Early childhood education is pushing up and making a difference in how things are delivered there. So that's happening. I'm going to move on. How am I doing for time? course, I didn't bring a watch up. Right? Okay. Learning environment. We're seeing across the country increasing professionalism. We all know, and I think I'm preaching to the choir, we all know it's the educator, this responsiveness, knowledge, skills of the educator that matters most to quality. There is no magic bullet curriculum. There is no magic bullet physical environment. What matters most is the cognitive and emotional sensitivity of the educator that works directly with the kids. Okay, and we're seeing an increasing professionalism. The number of people with qualifications is going up, and certification requirements are going up. In this province, in your child care strategy, has required that everybody have, I think it's level 1 certification, which is a 1-year certificate, which is is a huge jump up from what used to be here, and that's pretty recent. We're seeing those kinds of push up across the country. We're seeing more degree programs go on, early childhood education degree programs. It's not PEI is considering making it a requirement for supervisors in their early years centers. I understand that's under consideration, and more of those folks are having that requirement. I've talked about salaries before. We're seeing the curriculum frameworks, early learning frameworks emerge across the country to people from outside of Canada. They don't understand why we have one for every jurisdiction, why we don't have one pan-Canadian one. They just don't get Canada and the fact we don't have a central education. But we're seeing people are borrowing from each other and building on each other. And yours is under development now. I have not seen it. I'd love to see it sometime soon. But my understanding is it's a 0 to 8 focus. Okay? So it's got application in the primary grades, and it's got application not just for licensed childcare and preschools, but for family resource programs. It's going to reach across and be piloted in all of those different settings. And that's a unique, nobody else has done that. People have talked about how it can be, but it's kind of like an afterthought, or it happens later. This went out the door with that goal in mind. So it seems like you've really thought about it, looked around at what others are doing, and seen this as a good idea. None of the early learning frameworks are focusing on subject areas and, do they have the early literacies? Those may be embedded in it, but they're really focused around very habits of mind or developmental domains or that sort of thing. And they're all very play-based, purposeful play-based. And we're seeing that have an impact on some of the kindergarten curriculums, notably in Ontario and BC. Really, those have changed quite dramatically because of the push-up of what's happening in early learning. And we're seeing this pedagogical focus. It varies from place to place about child-directed and educator-guided. And it varies. And I care more about the skills of the educator than where they come on this balance myself. But we're not seeing teacher-directed pedagogy emerging as the goals in early childhood education. And that's pretty much a theme across the country. Okay, accountability. Now, here's where there are some real cultural differences between education and early childhood education. In early childhood education, we talk about how we're doing. We really look at monitoring program quality more than we do to see how the program's doing. We don't look at child outcomes to tell us how our program's doing. I don't know in this province. I do know in Ontario, many people look at the grade 3 reading and literacy scores of the kids and make judgment about the quality of the education. Okay, so there is a real cultural difference there that in how we look at outcomes, and it's no province actually does any kind of quality assessment or program evaluation of what's going on in their kindergarten programs. They may do it informally. There may be ways within school districts, but there's no formal assessment, or are they even meeting minimum standards and that sort of thing. And what's coming across as a theme across many of our jurisdictions is looking at pedagogical documentation or narration or learning stories or those whatever you want to call it as being the way to monitor how kids are doing, to really uncover the learning and document it well based on what the kids can do and say and know rather than what they don't know and do and say. Okay? And that's a very different approach than developmental and skill checklists or assessments. And some people are successfully merging them, but definitely that there's a lot of interest in documentation and narration, and it's drifting up into kindergarten and primary school. Lots of different ways to review program from a standardized measure like the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale, which has been around for a long time, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, or the assessment tool that's being consultative assessment tool that's being, it's collaborative assessment tool in New Brunswick. That is a mistake. Collaborative assessment tool in New Brunswick, where they took their early learning framework and the principles in it, and they went and talked to practitioners and post-secondary educators and researchers and identified what would it look like if we were meeting those principles. And they put together guidelines for it. So it's not a checklist, it's not a standardized measure, but it's a tool that's interactive, that gets you thinking and talking with your colleagues and looking what you're doing. And that should be out soon. Provinces, in terms of, I forgot to mention child outcomes, a lot of provinces, in fact, I think we're just about at everybody, is either collecting early development instrument or the early years evaluation. One of those two tools that is meant to take a broad level snapshot of where kids are at as at the 5-year-old kind of mark before they go into the formal school system. EDI is not meant to be a curriculum tool to guide curriculum. It's very much meant to be look at how the population of kids are doing, just like public health looks at where are we at on birth outcomes, what's our low birth weight rate across the region. Okay, so it's not meant to be used as a skill checklist. EYE can be used either to aggregate up and look at the population or as more of an individual checklist. And pretty much every jurisdiction is doing that now. Finally, we have system monitoring. Every province and territory that signed the Early Child Development Agreement in 2000 is expected, and the multilateral child care framework is expected to make a report, public report, about how they're spending the money and how kids are doing, and that's happening various levels across the country. And finally, we have the Early Childhood Education Report that was launched in the earlier study that looks at 19 benchmarks across the country and how provinces and territories are doing. And that will be released again in 2014. And this is what it looked like in 2011. And the first is governance, and you see the blue bars, and this really looked at, is it a unified oversight? Is there a policy framework that's comprehensive? Is there anything happening on the local regional stuff and that sort of thing? The second one was funding. The benchmark there was, is the jurisdiction spending at least 3% of the provincial budget on early childhood education? And is there program funding, or is it all fee subsidy? What are the salaries like? Are they, I think it was 60% of what teachers' salaries are, was the benchmark there. The next one was access. Are over 50% of the kids between 2 and 4 able to access an early childhood education program? Is there a requirement that publicly funded programs provide access to children with special needs? Learning environment looked at, is there a curriculum framework? What are the professional qualifications? What kinds of requirements are there for certification and professional development, professional learning opportunities, and that sort of thing? And then the accountability was, is that province reporting to the federal government? Are they monitoring all programs, including their publicly funded kindergarten programs, and are they collecting some sort of snapshot of where kids are at before they enter formal schooling of grade 1? We expect this is going to look quite different next time. We know that Newfoundland's already increased, and will look quite different next time. New Brunswick's going to look very different. BC may not look too different. And we know, and so forth and so on. And that these are all collected, these data are collected from public sources, reviewed with provinces, but collected from public sources and national longitudinal surveys and so forth and so on. And that work is being conducted by the Atkinson Center with support from foundations, and will continue to come out every 3 years. There are 3 sources of information that might, if you want to know more about this, there are a lot of resources on the Atkinson Center website. There's a policy monitor that keeps track of what's happening in every jurisdiction and tries, and if something's happened in your jurisdiction and it's not up there, shoot an email in. And then there's the Starting Strong 3 toolbox, which gives you lots of examples of what's happening in all of these areas in many, many, many countries, and it's very useful. So that is something that, if you're interested in that. The other thing you can do is get on the Atkinson Center listserv, and you get a weekly bulletin of various things. It takes a couple of minutes to scan through. There may only be one thing you're interested in opening up, but it really does collect most of the developments that's happening across the country. And if there's something that's happening here you'd like broadcast so other people can see it across the country, you can send it in. So that is the end of what I have to say.